Joseph Conrad wrote to a friend to this effect, that life made him feel like a cornered blind rat waiting to be clubbed. This simile could well describe the appalling circumstances of us all. Nevertheless, some of us are struck with good luck, and that is what happened to me. I had been news vendor, printer, toy maker, glass blower, doctor's boy, etc. But during these occupational digressions, like Sidney, I never lost sight of my ultimate aim to become an actor. So between jobs I would polish my shoes, brush my clothes, put on a clean collar, and make periodical calls at Blackmore's theatrical agency in Bedford Street off the Strand. I did this until the state of my clothes forbade any further visits. The first time I went there, the office was adorned with immaculately dressed thespians of both sexes, standing about talking grandiloquently to each other. With trepidation I stood in a far corner near the door, painfully shy, trying to conceal my weather-worn suit and shoes slightly budding at the toes. From the inner office, a young clerk sporadically appeared and like a reaper would cut through the thespian hauteur with the laconic remark, "Nothing for you, or you, or you," and the office would clear like the emptying of a church. On one occasion I was left standing alone. When the clerk saw me, he stopped abruptly. "What do you want?" I felt like Oliver Twist asking for more. "Have you any boys' parts?" I gulped. "Have you registered?" I shook my head. To my surprise, he ushered me into the adjoining office and took my name and address and all particulars, saying that if anything came up he would let me know. I left with a pleasant sense of having performed a duty, but also rather thankful that nothing had come of it. And now, 1 month after Sidney's return, I received a postcard. It read, "Would you call at Blackmore's agency, Bedford Street, Strand?" In my new suit I was ushered into the presence of Mr. Blackmore himself, who was all smiles and amiability. Mr. Blackmore, whom I had imagined to be almighty and scrutinizing, was most kindly, and gave me a note to deliver to Mr. C.E. Hamilton at the offices of Charles Frohman. Mr. Hamilton read it and was amused and surprised to see how small I was. He explained that I was to play Billy, the page boy in Sherlock Holmes, for a tour of 40 weeks, which was to start in the autumn. "In the meantime," said Mr. Hamilton, "there is an exceptionally good boy's part in a new play, Jim, the Romance of a Cockney, written by Mr. H.A. Saintsbury, the gentleman who is to play the title role in Sherlock Holmes on the forthcoming tour. Jim would be produced in Kingston for a trial engagement, prior to the tour of Holmes. The salary was £2 10 a week, the same as I would get for Sherlock Holmes. Although the sum was a windfall, I never batted an eye. I must consult my brother about the terms," I said solemnly. Mr. Hamilton laughed and seemed highly amused, then brought out the whole office staff to have a look at me. "This is our Billy. What do you think of him?" Everyone was delighted and smiled beamingly at me. What had happened? It seemed the world had suddenly changed, had taken me into its fond embrace and adopted me. Then Mr. Hamilton gave me a note to Mr. Saintsbury, whom he said I would find at the Green Room Club at Leicester Square, and I left, walking on clouds. The same thing happened at the Green Room Club, Mr. Saintsbury calling out other members to have a look at me. Then and there he handed me the part of Sammy, saying that it was one of the important characters in the play. I was a little nervous for fear he might ask me to read it on the spot, which would have been embarrassing as I was almost unable to read. Fortunately, he told me to take it home and read it at leisure, as they would not be starting rehearsals for another week. I went home on the bus dazed with happiness, and began the full realization of what had happened to me. I had suddenly left behind a life of poverty and was entering a long-desired dream, a dream my mother had often spoken about and had reveled in. I was to become an actor. It had all come so suddenly, so unexpectedly. I kept thumbing the pages of my part. It had a new, brown paper cover, the most important document I have ever held in my life. During the ride on the bus, I realized I had crossed an important threshold. No longer was I a nondescript of the slums. Now I was the personage of the theatre. I wanted to weep. Sidney's eyes were filmy when I told him what had happened. He sat crouched on the bed, thoughtfully looking out of the window, shaking and nodding his head, then said gravely, "This is the turning point in our lives. If only Mother was here to enjoy it with us." "Think of it," I continued enthusiastically. 40 weeks at £2 10. I told Mr. Hamilton you attended to all business matters, so," I added eagerly, "we might even get more. Anyway, we can save £60 this year." After our enthusiasm had simmered down, we reasoned that £2 10 was hardly enough for such a big part. Sidney went to see if he could raise the ante. "There's no harm in trying," I said, but Mr. Hamilton was adamant. £2.10 is the maximum, he said, and we were happy to get it. Sidney read the part to me and helped me to memorize the lines. It was a big part, about 35 sides, but I knew it all by heart in 3 days. The rehearsals of Jim took place in the upstairs foyer of the Drury Lane Theatre. Sidney had so zealously coached me that I was almost word perfect. Only one word bothered me. The line was, "Who do you think you are, Mr. Pierpont Morgan?" And I would say, "Putterpint Morgan." Mr. Saintsbury made me keep it in. Those first rehearsals were a revelation. They opened up a new world of technique. I had no idea that there was such a thing as stagecraft. Timing, pausing, a cue to turn, to sit. But it came naturally to me. Only one fault Mr. Saintsbury corrected. I moved my head and mugged too much when I talked. After rehearsing a few scenes, he was astonished and wanted to know if I had acted before. What a glow of satisfaction, pleasing Mr. Saintsbury and the rest of the cast. However, I accepted their enthusiasm as though it were my natural birthright. Jim was to be a tryout for 1 week at the Kingston Theatre and for another week at the Fulham. It was a melodrama patterned on Henry Arthur Jones' Silver King, the story of an aristocrat suffering from amnesia who finds himself living in a garret with a young flower girl and a newspaper boy, Sammy, my part. Morally, it was all on the up and up. The girl slept in the cupboard of the garret, while the Duke, as we called him, enjoyed the couch, and I slept on the floor. The first act was at number 7A, Devereux Court, the Temple, the chambers of James Seaton Gatlock, a wealthy lawyer. The tattered Duke, having called on his rival of a past love affair, begs for alms to help his sick benefactor, the flower girl who had supported him during his amnesia. In an altercation, the villain says to the Duke, "Get out! Go and starve, you and your Costa mistress!" The Duke, though frail and weak, picks up a paper knife from the desk, as if to strike the villain, but it drops from his hands to the desk as he is stricken with epilepsy, falling unconscious at the villain's feet. At this juncture, the villain's ex-wife, with whom the tattered Duke was once in love, enters the room. She also pleads for the tattered Duke, saying, He failed me at the bar! At least you can help him!" But the villain refuses. The scene rises to a climax, in which he accuses his ex-wife of infidelity with the derelict, and denounces her also. In a frenzy, she picks up the paper knife that fell from the derelict's hand and stabs the villain, who falls dead in his armchair, while the derelict still lies unconscious at his feet. The woman disappears from the scene, and the Duke, regaining consciousness, discovers his rival dead. "God, what have I done?" says he. Then business follows. He searches the dead man's pockets, finds a wallet in which he fingers several pounds, a diamond ring and jewellery, all of which he takes, and as he leaves by the window he turns, saying, "Goodbye, Gatlock. You did help me after all." Curtain. The next act was the garret in which the Duke lived. The scene opened with a lone detective searching into a cupboard. I enter, whistling, then stop, saying the detective. "Oi, you! Do you know that's a lady's bedroom?" "What? That cupboard? Come here." "The cold cheek of him." "You stole that. Come in here and shut the door." "Polite, ain't you, inviting blokes into their own drawing room?" "I'm a detective." "What? A cop? I'm off." "I'm not going to hurt you. All I want is a little information that will help to do someone a good turn." "A good turn indeed. If a bit of luck comes to anyone here, it won't be through the cops." "Don't be a fool. Would I have started by telling you I was in the force?" "Thanks for nothing. I could see your boots. Who lives here?" "The Duke." "Yes, but what's his real name?" "I don't know. The Duke is a nom de guerre, as he calls it. Though blow me if I know what it means." "And what does he look like?" "As thin as a lath. Grey hair, clean-shaven, wears a top hat and an eyeglass. And blimey, the way he looks at you through it." "And Jim, who's he?" "He? You mean she." "Ah, then she's the lady who sleeps in the cupboard. This here room's ours, mine and the Duke's," etc., etc. There was much more to the part, and believe it or not, it was highly amusing to the audience, due, I think, to my looking much younger than I was. Every line I spoke got a laugh. Only mechanics bothered me, the business of making real tea on the stage. I would get confused about whether to put the tea in the pot first or the hot water. Paradoxically enough, it was easier for me to talk lines than to carry out stage business. Jim was not a success. The reviewers panned the play unmercifully. Nevertheless, I received favourable notices. One, which Mr. Charles Rock, a member of our company, showed me, was exceptionally good. He was an old Adelphi actor, of considerable reputation, and I played most of my scenes with him. "Young man," said he solemnly, "don't get a swollen head when you read this." and after lecturing me about modesty and graciousness, he read the review of the London Tropical Times, which I remember word for word. After writing disparagingly of the play, it continued, "But there is one redeeming feature. The part of Sammy, a newspaper boy, a smart London street Arab, much responsible for the comic part. Although hackneyed and old-fashioned, Sammy was vastly amusing by Master Charles Chaplin, a bright and vigorous child actor. I have never heard of the boy before, but I hope to hear great things of him in the near future." Sydney bought a dozen copies. After completing the 2 weeks' run of Jim, we started rehearsals for Sherlock Holmes. During this time, Sydney and I were still living at Pall Mall Terrace, because economically we were not too sure of our footing. During rehearsal, Sydney and I went to Cane Hill to see Mother. At first, the nurses told us that she could not be seen and that she was not well that day. They took Sydney aside out of my hearing, but I heard him say, "No, I don't think you would." Then, turning to me sadly, "You don't want to see Mother in a padded room?" No, I couldn't bear it," I said, recoiling. But Sydney saw her, and Mother recognized him and became rational. A few minutes later, a nurse told me that Mother was well enough, and we sat together in her padded room. Before we left, she took me aside and whispered forlornly, "Don't lose your way, because they might keep you here." She remained 18 months at Cane Hill before regaining her health. Sydney saw her regularly while I was on tour. Mr. H.A. Saintsbury, who played Holmes on tour, was a living replica of the illustrations in the Strand magazine. He had a long, sensitive face and an inspired forehead. Of all those who played Holmes, he was considered the best, even better than William Gillette, the original Holmes and the author of the play. On my first tour, the management decided that I should live with Mr. and Mrs. Green, the carpenter of the company, and his wife, the wardrobe lady. This was not very glamorous. Besides, Mr. and Mrs. Green drank occasionally. Moreover, I did not always want to eat when they did, or eat what they ate. I'm sure my living with the Greens was more irksome to them than to me, so after 3 weeks we mutually agreed to part, and being too young to live with other members of the cast, I lived alone. I was alone in strange towns, alone in back rooms, rarely meeting anyone until the evening's performance, only hearing my own voice when I talked to myself. Occasionally I would go to the saloon where members of the company gathered and watched them play billiards, but I always felt that my presence cramped their conversation, and they were quite obvious in making me feel so. I could not smile at their levity without being frowned upon. I began to grow melancholy. Arriving in northern towns on a Sunday night, hearing the doleful clanging of church bells as I walked the darkened Main Street, added little comfort to my loneliness. On weekdays I would scan the local markets and do my shopping, buying groceries and meat for the landlady to cook. Sometimes I would get bored in lodging and eat in the kitchen with the family. I liked this, for north country kitchens were clean and wholesome, with polished fire grates and blue hearths. When the landlady baked bread, it was cheerful to come out of a cold, dark day into the red glow of a Lancashire kitchen fire, and see tins of unbaked loaves around the hearth, and sit down to tea with the family. The taste of hot bread just out of the oven with fresh butter was relished with grave solemnity. I had been in the provinces for 6 months. Meanwhile, Sydney had little success in getting a job in the theatre, so he was obliged to descend from his thespian ambition and apply for a job as a bartender at the Coal Hole in the Strand. Out of 150 applicants, he got the job, but he had fallen ignominiously from his own graces, as it were. He wrote to me regularly and kept me posted about Mother, but I seldom answered his letters. For one reason, I could not spell very well. One letter touched me deeply and drew me very close to him. He reproached me for not answering his letters and recalled the misery we had endured together, which should unite us even closer. "Since Mother's illness," wrote Sydney, "all we have in the world is each other. So you must write regularly, and let me know that I have a brother." His letter was so moving that I replied immediately. Now I saw Sydney in another light. His letter cemented a brotherly love that has lasted throughout my life. I got accustomed to living alone, but I got so much out of the habit of talking that when I suddenly met a member of the company I suffered intense embarrassment. I could not collect myself quickly enough to answer questions intelligently, and they would leave me, I am sure, with alarm and concern for my reason. Miss Greta Horn, for instance, our leading lady, was beautiful, charming, and most kindly, yet when I saw her crossing the road toward me, I would quickly turn and look into a shop window, and go down another street in order to avoid her. I began to neglect myself and became desultory in my habits. When travelling with the company, I was always late at the railway station, arriving at the last moment, dishevelled and without a collar, and was continually reprimanded for it. For company I bought a rabbit, and wherever I stayed I would smuggle it into my room unknown to the landlady. It was an endearing little thing, though not housebroken. Its fur was so white and clean that it belied its pungent odor. I kept it in a wooden cage hidden under the bed. The landlady would cheerfully enter the room with my breakfast until she contacted the odor. Then she would leave, looking worried and confused. The moment she was gone, I would release the rabbit and it would lope about the room. Before long I had it trained to run to its box every time there was a knock at the door. If the landlady discovered my secret, I would have the rabbit perform this trick, which usually won her heart, and she would put up with us for the week. But in Tony Pandy Wales, after I showed my trick, the landlady smiled cryptically and made no comment. But when I returned from the theatre that night, my pet had gone. When I inquired about it, the landlady merely shook her head. It must have run away, or someone must have stolen it. She had, in her own way, handled the problem efficaciously. From Tony Pandy we went to the mining town of Ebbw Vale, a 3-night stand, and I was thankful it was not longer, for Ebbw Vale was a dank, ugly town in those days, with row upon row of hideous uniform houses, each house consisting of 4 small rooms lit by oil lamps. Most of the company put up at a small hotel. Fortunately, I found a front room in a miner's house, and though small, it was comfortable and clean. At night after the play, my supper was left in front of the fire to keep warm. The landlady, a tall, handsome, middle-aged woman, had an aura of tragedy about her. She came in the morning with my breakfast and hardly spoke a word. I noticed that the kitchen door was always shut. Whenever I wanted anything, I had to knock, and the door opened only a few inches. The second night, while I was having my supper, her husband came in, a man about the same age as his wife. He had been to the theatre that evening and had enjoyed the play. He stood a while conversing, holding a lighted candle ready for bed. He came to a pause, and seemed to think of what he wanted to say. "Listen, I've got something that might fit your kind of business. Ever seen a human frog? Here, hold the candle and I'll take the lamp." He led the way into the kitchen and rested the lamp on the dresser, which had a curtain strung across the bottom in place of cupboard doors. "Hey, Gilbert, come on out of there," he said, parting the curtains. A man with no legs, an oversized, blonde, flat-shaped head, a sickening white face, a sunken nose, a large mouth, and powerful muscular shoulders and arms crawled from underneath the dresser. He wore flannel underwear with the legs of the garment cut off to the thighs, from which 10 thick, stubby toes stuck out. The grisly creature could have been 20 or 40. He looked up and grinned, showing a set of yellow, widely spaced teeth. "Hey, Gilbert, jump!" said the father, and the wretched man lowered himself slowly, then shot up by his arms almost to the height of my head. How do you think he'd fit in with the circus? The human frog! I was so horrified I could hardly answer. However, I suggested the names of several circuses that he might write to. He insisted on the wretched creature's going through further tricks, hopping, climbing, and standing on his hands on the arms of a rocking chair. When at last he finished, I pretended to be most enthusiastic, and complimented him on his tricks. "Good night, Gilbert," I said before leaving, and in a hollow voice and tongue-tied the poor fellow answered, "Good night." Several times during the night I woke up and tried my locked door. The next morning the landlady seemed pleasant and communicative. "I understand you saw Gilbert last night," she said. "Of course, he only sleeps under the dresser when we take in people from the theatre." Then the awful thought came to me that I had been sleeping in Gilbert's bed. "Yes," I answered, and talked with measured enthusiasm of the possibilities of his joining a circus. She nodded. "We have often thought about it." My enthusiasm, or whatever it was, seemed to please the landlady, and before leaving I went into the kitchen to say goodbye to Gilbert. With an effort to be casual, I shook his large, calloused hand, and he gently shook mine. After 40 weeks in the provinces, we returned to play 8 weeks around the suburbs of London. Sherlock Holmes, being a phenomenal success, was to start a second tour 3 weeks after the finish of the first one. Now Sydney and I decided to give up our quarters in Pall Mall Terrace and take up more respectable ones in the Kennington Road. Like snakes, we wanted to slow our skins, shedding every vestige of the past. I spoke to the management about Sydney for a small part in the next tour of Holmes, and he got it, 35 shillings a week. Now we were on tour together. Sydney wrote to Mother every week, and toward the end of our second tour we received a letter from Cane Hill Asylum stating that she had fully recovered her health. This was indeed good news. Quickly we made arrangements for her discharge, and made preparations for her to join us in Reading. To celebrate the occasion, we took a special deluxe apartment consisting of 2 bedrooms and a sitting room with a piano, fixed up her bedroom with flowers, and arranged an elaborate dinner to boot. Sydney and I waited for her at the railroad station, tense and happy. Yet I could not help feeling anxious as to how she would fit into our lives again, knowing that the close ties of other days could never be recaptured. At last the train arrived. With excitement and uncertainty, we scanned the faces of the passengers as they left the carriages. Then at last, there she was, smiling and walking sedately toward us. She displayed no great emotion as we went to meet her, but greeted us with affectionate decorum. She evidently was also undergoing an adjustment. In that short ride in a cab to our rooms, we talked of 100 different things, relevant and irrelevant. After the first flush of enthusiasm of showing her the apartment and the flowers in the bedroom, we found ourselves in the sitting room looking breathlessly at each other. It was a sunny day, and our apartment was on a quiet street, but now the silence of it was uncomfortable, and in spite of my wanting to be happy, I found myself fighting back a depression. Poor mother, who wanted so little out of life to make her gay and cheerful, reminded me of my unhappy past, the last person in the world who should have affected me this way. But I did my best to hide the fact. She had aged a little and gained weight. I had always been proud of the way mother looked and dressed and wanted to show her off to the company at her best, but now she appeared rather dowdy. She must have sensed my misgivings, for she turned inquiringly. Coyly I adjusted a strand of her hair. "Before you meet the company," I smiled, "I want you to be at your best." She looked at me, then took out her powder puff and rubbed it over her face. "I'm just happy to be alive," she said cheerfully. It was not long before we were fully adjusted to one another, and my dejection passed. That we had outgrown the intimacy she had known when we were children, she understood better than we did, which made her all the more endearing to us. On tour she did the shopping and catering, bringing home fruits and delicacies and always a few flowers. For no matter how poor we had been in the past, when shopping on Saturday nights she had always been able to buy a pennyworth of wallflowers. Occasionally she was quiet and reserved, and her detachment saddened me. She acted more like a guest than our mother. After a month she wanted to return to London, because she was anxious to get settled down so that she would have a home for us after our tour. Besides, as she said, it would be less costly than travelling over the country and having to pay an extra fare. She rented the flat over the barber shop in Chester Street where we had once lived, and with £10 bought furniture on the instalment plan. The rooms had not the spaciousness of Versailles or its elegance, but she did wonders in the bedroom by covering orange crates with cretonne to make them look like commodes. Between us, Sydney and I were earning £4 5 a week, and sending £1 5 of it to mother. Sydney and I returned home after our second tour and spent a few weeks with her. Although we were happy to be with mother, we were secretly glad to get away on tour again, for Chester Street had not the requisite comforts that provincial apartments had, those little amenities to which Sydney and I were now accustomed, and mother no doubt realized this. When she saw us off at the station she seemed cheerful enough, but we both thought she looked wistful as she stood on the platform smiling and waving her handkerchief as the train pulled away. During our third tour, mother wrote to us that Louise, with whom Sydney and I had lived in the Kennington Road, had died, ironically enough, in the Lambeth workhouse, the same place in which we had been confined. She survived father only by 4 years, leaving her little son an orphan, and he also had been sent to the same Hanwell schools that Sydney and I had been sent to. Mother wrote that she had visited the boy, explaining who she was and that Sydney and I had lived with him and his father and mother in the Kennington Road, but he hardly remembered, as he had been only 4 years old at the time. He also had no recollection of his father, and now he was 10. He was registered under Louise's maiden name, and as far as mother could find out, he had no relatives. She described him as being a handsome boy, very quiet, shy, and preoccupied. She brought him a bag of sweets and some oranges and apples and promised to visit him regularly, which I believe she did, until she herself became ill again and was sent back to Cane Hill. The news of mother's relapse came like a stab in the heart. We never knew the details. We received only a curt official notice that she had been found wandering and incoherent in the streets. There was nothing we could do but accept poor mother's fate. She never again recovered her mind completely. For several years she languished in Cane Hill Asylum, until we could afford to put her into a private one. Sometimes the gods of adversity tire of their sport and show mercy, as they did with mother. For the last 7 years of her life she was to live in comfort, surrounded by flowers and sunshine, to see her grown sons endowed with fame and fortune beyond anything she had ever imagined. Because of our tour with Sherlock Holmes, it was many weeks before Sidney and I could again see Mother. The tour with the Frohman Company ended permanently. Then Mr. Harry York, proprietor of the Theatre Royal, Blackburn, bought the rights to Holmes from Frohman to play the smaller towns. Sidney and I were engaged by the new company, but had reduced salaries of 35 shillings a week. It was a depressing come-down, playing the small towns of the north with an inferior company. Nevertheless, it enlivened my discrimination, comparing the company with the one we had just left. This comparison I tried to conceal, but at rehearsals, in my zeal to help the new director, who would ask me about stage directions, cues, and business, etc., I would eagerly tell him how it was done in the Frohman Company. This, of course, did not make me particularly popular with the cast, and I was looked upon as a precocious brat. Later, a new stage manager had it in for me, and fined me 10 shillings for having a button missing from my uniform, about which he had warned me several times. William Gillette, author of Sherlock Holmes, came to London with Marie Dorot in a play called Clarissa, which he had also written. The critics were unkind to the play, and to the manner of Gillette's speech, which led him to write a curtain raiser, The Painful Predicament of Sherlock Holmes, in which he himself never spoke a word. There were only 3 in the cast, a mad woman, Holmes, and his page boy. It was like tidings from heaven to receive a telegram from Mr. Postant, Gillette's manager, asking if I were available to come to London to play the part of Billy with William Gillette in The Curtain Raiser. I trembled with anxiety, for it was doubtful if our company could replace Billy in the provinces on such short notice, and for several days I was left in agonizing suspense. However, they did find another Billy. Returning to London to play in a West End theatre I can only describe as my renaissance. My brain was spinning with the thrill of every incident. Arriving in the evening at the Duke of York's theatre, and meeting Mr. Postant, the stage manager, who brought me to Mr. Gillette's dressing-room, and his words after I was introduced to him, "Would you like to play in Sherlock Holmes with me?" And my burst of nervous enthusiasm, "Oh, very much, Mr. Gillette!" And the next morning, waiting on the stage for rehearsals and seeing Marie Dorot for the first time, dressed in the loveliest white summer dress, the sudden shock of seeing someone so beautiful at that hour. She had been riding in a hansom cab and had discovered an ink spot on her dress, and wanted to know if the property man had anything that would take it out, and to his answer of doubt she made the prettiest expression of irritation. "Oh, isn't that too beastly?" She was so devastatingly beautiful that I resented her. I resented her delicate pouting lips, her regular white teeth, her adorable chin, her raven hair and dark brown eyes. I resented her presence of irritation and the charm she exuded through it. Through all this querying between herself and the property man, she was ignorant of my presence. Although I stood quite near, staring, transfixed by her beauty. I had just turned 16, and the propinquity of this sudden radiance evoked my determination not to be obsessed by it. But oh God, she was beautiful. It was love at first sight. In The Painful Predicament of Sherlock Holmes, Miss Irene Vanbrugh, a remarkably gifted actress, played the madwoman and did all the talking, while Holmes just sat and listened. This was his joke on the critics. I had the opening lines, bursting into Holmes' apartment and holding on to the doors while the madwoman beats against them outside, and then, while I excitedly tried to explain to Holmes the situation, the madwoman bursts in. For 20 minutes she never stops raving incoherently about some case that she wants him to solve. Surreptitiously, Holmes writes a note, rings a bell, and slips it to me. Later, 2 stalwart men lead the lady off, leaving Holmes and me alone, with me saying, "You were right, sir. It was the right asylum." The critics enjoyed the joke, but the play, Clarissa, which Gillette wrote for Marie Dorot, was a failure. Although they raved about Marie's beauty, they said it was not enough to hold a modern play together, so he completed the rest of his season with a revival of Sherlock Holmes, in which I was retained for the part of Billy. In my excitement to play with the famous William Gillette, I had forgotten to ask about terms. At the end of the week, Mr. Postant came apologetically with my pay envelope. "I'm really sorry to give you this," he said, "but at the Frohman office they said I was to pay you the same as you were getting with us before, £2.10. I was agreeably surprised. At rehearsals of Holmes, I met Marie Dorot again, more beautiful than ever. and in spite of my resolutions not to be overwhelmed by her, I began to sink further into the hopeless mire of silent love. I hated this weakness and was furious with myself for lack of character. It was an ambivalent affair. I both hated and loved her. What's more, she was charming and gracious to boot. In Holmes she played Alice Faulkner, but in the play we never met. I would wait, however, timing the moment when I could pass her on the stairs and gulp, "Good evening," and she would answer cheerfully, "Good evening." And that was all that ever passed between us. Holmes was an immediate success. During the engagement, Queen Alexandra saw the play. Sitting with her in the royal box were the King of Greece and Prince Christian. The prince was evidently explaining the play to the king, and during the most tense and silent moment, when Holmes and I were alone on the stage, a booming voice with an accent resounded throughout the theatre. "Don't tell me! Don't tell me!" Dion Boucicault had his offices in the Duke of York's theatre, and in passing he would give me an approving little tap on the head, as did Hall Caine, who frequently came backstage to see Gillette. On one occasion, I also received a smile from Lord Kitchener. During the run of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Henry Irving died, and I attended the funeral at Westminster Abbey. Being a West End actor, I was given a special pass, and I felt very proud of the fact. At the funeral I sat between the solemn Lewis Waller, then the romantic matinee idol of London, and Dr. Walford Bodie, of bloodless surgery fame, whom I later burlesqued in a vaudeville skit. Waller looked handsomely profiled for the occasion, sitting stiffly, looking neither right nor left, but Dr. Bodie, in order to get a better view as they lowered Sir Henry into the crypt, kept stepping on the chest of a supine duke, much to the indignation and contempt of Mr. Waller. I gave up trying to see anything and sat down, resigned to viewing the backsides of those in front of me. 2 weeks before the closing of Sherlock Holmes, Mr. Boucicault gave me a letter of introduction to the illustrious Mr. and Mrs. Kendall, with the prospects of getting a part in their new play. They were terminating a successful run at the St. James Theatre. The appointment was for 10 a.m., to meet the lady in the foyer of the theatre. She was 20 minutes late. Eventually a silhouette appeared off the street. It was Mrs. Kendall, a stalwart, imperious lady who greeted me with, "Oh, so you're the boy. We are shortly to begin a tour of the provinces in a new play, and I'd like to hear you read for the part. But at the moment we are very busy, so will you be here tomorrow morning at the same time?" "I'm sorry, madam," I replied coldly, "but I cannot accept anything out of town." And with that I raised my hat, walked out of the foyer, hailed a passing cab, and was out of work for 10 months. The night Sherlock Holmes ended its run at the Duke of York's theatre and Marie Doro was to return to America, I went off alone and got desperately drunk. 2 or 3 years later in Philadelphia I saw her again. She dedicated the opening of a new theatre in which I was playing in Carno's comedy company. She was still as beautiful as ever. I stood in the wings watching her in my comedy makeup while she made a speech, but I was too shy to make myself known to her. At the closing of Holmes in London, the company in the provinces also ended, so both Sidney and I were out of work. But Sidney lost no time in getting another job. As a result of seeing an advertisement in the Era, a theatrical paper, he joined Charlie Mannon's troupe of knockabout comedians. In those days there were several of these troupes touring the halls: Charlie Baldwin's bank clerks, Joe Bogani's lunatic bakers, and the Boycott troupe, all of them pantomimists. And although they played slapstick comedy, it was performed to beautiful music a la ballet and was most popular. The outstanding company was Fred Carno's, who had a large repertoire of comedies. Each one was called Birds. There were Jailbirds, Early Birds, Mumming Birds. From these 3 sketches Carno built a theatrical enterprise of more than 30 companies, whose repertoire included Christmas pantomimes and elaborate musical comedies, from which he developed such fine artists and comedians as Fred Kitchen, George Graves, Harry Weldon, Billy Reeves, Charlie Bell, and many others. It was while Sidney was working with the Mannon troupe that Fred Carno saw him and signed him up at a salary of £4 a week. Being 4 years younger than Sidney, I was neither fish nor fowl to any form of theatrical work, but I had saved a little money from the London engagement, and while Sidney was working in the provinces, I stayed in London and played around pool rooms.